to you as well. So this morning we have Ayya Soma, who will be talking about the Somā Sutta. So her name's Elaine Sanders says, clapping for Ayya Soma. Michael says, I'm looking forward to Ayya's talk this morning. Elaine says, thank you, Ayya Soma, for presenting us with the Dhamma. May this be a source of enlightenment for all. So people are happy about this. So if you're interested in following along, there's a link to the sutta towards the top of the live chat. And I'll go ahead and pass it over to Ayya Soma.
All right, thank you, Bhante, and thank you all friends for joining us this morning. So we can start by giving an homage to our teacher. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham nam nam sangam namasami. So this morning, Ayya Soma will be talking about bhikkhuni Soma. So the Samyutta Nikaya 5.2, the Somā Sutta in the Bhikkhuni Samyutta, which was one of the suttas that I like the most. I know I say this for pretty much every sutta. But it did get me it did make pretty strong mark in my mind in understanding the Dhamma for so many different reasons, which is why then Bhante Sudazo told my preceptor, Venerable Panyavati, and I was honored to have the name Soma. So we can start by reading the sutta. Actually, perhaps since it's not that long, maybe we can go, we can read it all in one shot, and then we can have a bit of a sort of discussion or analysis. But I quite like reading it first to prime the mind and to kind of also allow you to have, allow for each one to have, your own kind of thoughts and ideas sort of come to fruition in the mind. Setting at Savatthi. Then in the morning, the bhikkhuni Soma dressed and taking bowl and robe, entered Savatthi for alms. When she had walked for alms in Savatthi and had returned from her alms round, after her meal she went to the blind men's grove for the day's abiding. Having plunged into the blind men's grove, she sat down at the foot of a tree for the day's abiding. Then Māra, the evil one, desiring to arouse fear, trepidation, and terror in the bhikkhuni Soma, desiring to make her fall away from concentration, approached her and addressed her in verse. That state so hard to achieve, which is to be attained by the seers, can't be attained by a woman with her two-fingered wisdom. Then it occurred to the bhikkhuni Soma, now who is that recited that verse? A human being or a non-human being? Then it occurred to her, this is Māra, the evil one, who has recited the verse, desiring to arouse fear, trepidation, and terror in me, desiring to make me fall away from concentration. Then the bhikkhuni Soma, having understood, this is Māra, the evil one, replied to him in verses. What does womanhood matter at all when the mind is concentrated well, when knowledge flows unsteadily as one sees correctly into Dhamma? One to whom it might occur, I'm a woman, or I'm a man, or I'm anything at all, is fit for Māra to address. Then Māra, the evil one, realizing the bhikkhuni Soma knows me, sad and disappointed, disappeared right there. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So much Dhamma Sukha in my mind. Whenever I read it, every time I have a predictable effect. So it's a very beautiful translation from Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. So we can give it a few seconds to let it sit in the mind. We can start going through the sutta again. So when I actually had this reading with some friends last year, one of the first things that was pointed out was the sort of quirky name, Blind Man's Grove, of the place where Bhikkhuni Soma is dwelling. And it was kind of interesting to me because I had never paid attention to that particular name in that particular location, even though I quite like all the quirky names in the suttas. So I love, Deer Park. I love the Squirrels Sanctuary and so forth. But for some reason, the Blind Man's Grove didn't make quite a mark in my mind. But it is actually in the Bhikkhuni Samyutta, you can see the sort of similar kind of start. So there's a kind of stock phrase few stock phrases that go repeatedly throughout all the different suttas, and it's fundamentally always Māra coming to tempt each one of the bhikkhunis. And they all happen to be dwelling into the Blind Man's Grove. And actually, the commentary has an interesting story about the Blind Man's Grove. Whether it's true or not, it's to be seen. But it's actually quite amusing. So when the person pointed it out, I was like, oh, let me check out what the Blind Man's Grove is. And apparently it was after the Buddha Kassapa's parinibbana, Yasodhara was this woman called Yasodhara was there, and she was ambushed by thieves. But she was an enlightened being. And so since the thieves incurred so much bad karma, apparently the story is that they lost their sight on sight, like immediately. And they started basically dwelling for quite a long time I assume as in the form of spirits in what became called as the Blind Man's Grove. And that became one of the places where all the different bhikkhus and bhikkhunis at the time of the Buddha were going to practice seclusion. So we see all the bhikkhunis in the Bhikkhuni Samyutta dwelling in the Blind Man's Grove, but it's also, I found it like a quirky story because of the sort of instant bad karma that these thieves had. Don't mess with women, apparently. Definitely enlightened women. And so we'll see later on in the sutta what happens. So we see as Bhikkhuni Soma dresses, goes for alms, then she goes and dwells in the Blind Man's Grove. And at a certain point, Māra, the evil one, appears with the aspiration, as Māra likes to do, with pretty much any spiritual practitioner, including the Buddha, to trick them and distract them and sort of kind of get them to fall away from practice. So he starts by addressing her with the statement, that state so hard to achieve. So what is that state that is so hard to achieve? So it's clearly Nibbana. So the pursuit for awakening that then Māra goes and says, which is to be attained by the seers. So all the spiritual practitioners, all the not only the followers of the Buddha, but pretty much anyone who enters a spiritual path and is looking for awakening. And of course, in this context, it's clearly aimed at enlightenment, at supreme blissful enlightenment as taught by the Buddha. And what he does is present a bhikkhuni Soma with one of the sort of cliches, stereotypes that were very present at the time of the Buddha and are actually still present up to this day, both in Buddhist countries and in non-Buddhist countries, both in the East, both in the West. So he goes and says, it can't be attained possibly by a woman with her two-fingered wisdom. Now, the commentary has also another interesting story about this two-fingered wisdom. So according to the commentary, back in the time of the Buddha, it was common to refer in a derogatory way to women in terms of their capacity of wisdom or intelligence, in the way that it was basically equivalent to their way of checking rice by putting rice into the two fingers. So this was, according to the commentary, the two-fingered wisdom. So they could only understand whether or not the rice was cooked by putting it in their two fingers. Now, Bhante Sudazo has a different interpretation of that, which might be more accurate, or perhaps both of them are accurate. So it's kind of like saying you just have two fingers of wisdom rather than either full set of fingers, or perhaps even more than that. So whether you take the commentaries sort of description or Bhante Sudazo's description, the message is pretty clear. So it kind of aims to talk about, to instill doubt in Bhikkhuni Soma's capacity for awakening to begin with. And by it's done in a way that uses certain stereotypes presented in the culture at large to create the conditions for trepidation in the mind, conditions for the mind to become unstable, unsettled, and to develop the hindrance of doubt, which is doubt in our capacity for awakening, and consequentially in our Buddha nature, and consequentially in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. So all three of these, they seem kind of separate, but in reality they're interdependent. So whenever we build, we nurture our faith in the triple gem, we are nurturing our capacity, our conviction that we can actually do it, that we can actually live the holy life, that we trust our Buddha nature, our innate capacity for awakening. And whenever instead we dwell in doubt, we hinder both our capacity and our faith in the triple gem. So getting back to the two-fingered wisdom, this is obviously all the stereotypes, as we were saying, that we find about gender. So there's lots of different unfortunate sort of stereotypes that float around, especially in traditional Buddhist circles, and also pretty progressive Buddhist circles as well, which come from a misunderstanding of the teachings to begin with, and we'll look at it a little bit perhaps later. But fundamentally, what you will hear is that being female, for example, is a source of bad karma. So just the fact that one is born female is already a hindrance towards awakening. We get to the point that even the word to describe woman in the Tibetan tradition, so not in actually the Buddhist Tibetan tradition, but rather in the Tibetan language, so in the secular language, which is strongly influenced by Buddhism, is a synonym of inferior rebirth. So there is a male, and then there is an inferior rebirth. So this is a pretty strong statement, something quite vivid that permeates the experience of lots of women through the world. Other stereotypes that you will hear is that women are too emotional, or perhaps have a lot of anger, or perhaps have lots of different characteristics by birth, innate characteristics by birth, that are a hindrance towards awakening. Obviously, this is always in relation to a male counterpart, and all the in-between is kind of pretty much overlooked altogether, since we've, in the past millennia, apparently there hasn't been much discussion about also different types of gender identity to begin with. Or even when it comes to actual genitals that normally are equated with gender identity, and these days it's not quite the case anymore. Even when it comes to genitals themselves, there can be quite a lot of in between. Not necessarily it is either a male or female. So intersex, for example, people are more common than what we like to think in general parlance, and it's not even something that is artificially sort of brought up, but it's actually by birth one is intersex. But one can get very stuck on this idea of gender, but in reality, what I think is very important here is that we can really switch the message of Māra with pretty much anything that has to do with any kind of stereotypes that are currently present in our culture. So this can easily be replaced with race. So it can be replaced with that state so hard to achieve, which is to attain by the seers, can't be attained by a Black woman or a Black man, or perhaps by, you name it. Well, probably in this culture, perhaps it would be even by an Asian man or an Asian woman, even though actually these teachings are coming from Asia. That'd be bizarre. But there is a certain race balance in this country. And you can then follow with her two-fingered wisdom. You can replace that with any kind of racial stereotype that you hear in this culture. When I say this culture, I'm talking about American culture, because the monastery where I am is currently in the United States. So if I were giving this talk in Italy, then we would have some other different stereotypes, and that would be perhaps more relevant. But once again, this can also apply to nationality. You can say it definitely can't be attained by an Italian with their loud personality, vocal personality, or their obsession with food. Actually, we had someone coming to Buddhist Insights once, and he was sharing how, according to him, Italians weren't really capable of understanding Buddhism because they had a strong aversion to the idea of non-self. Hence, they were not capable of understanding non-self. So it was inherent in the culture, and I was quite shocked and amused at the same time that he had such a weird view. He was a foreigner. He was a European who had spent some time in Italy and hardly knew the language. But he was quite convinced about this point. But actually, one of the things that actually made a strong impact in my mind, being someone born and bred in Italy, was in fact non-self, the concept of non-self. I was like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. It gave me so many answers to my life. So clearly, his pre-existing idea of what an Italian can appreciate about the Dhamma or understand about the Dhamma or take with the Dhamma was a little bit flawed. Another way to replace this can be through age. So perhaps can't be attained by a young person with their immature traits, or by an old person. They've already lived their entire life. They can't really start practicing the Dhamma right now. They wouldn't understand anything. They have all their set views, set sort of ways of doing things. Similar thing, ableism. So you name it. There's endless ways through which us unenlightened beings like to discriminate upon another and create lots of stereotypes in the mind. So it so happens that in the Somā Sutta, gender is what is addressed. So what Māra brings up. And I quite love how then the second passage goes, and which is a stock phrase too. You'll see it repeated throughout the Bhikkhuni Samyutta, but it's actually no different in the Māra Samyutta. So whenever, and in other places in the Pali Canon, so whenever Māra attacks the spiritual practitioner, including the Buddha and his followers, then at a certain point, in this case, Bhikkhuni Soma throws up. Wait a second. Where is this coming from? So let me assess the situation without rejecting it or taking it. Like, where is this coming from? So assessing, clearly seeing what is happening. And then this is Māra, the evil one, who has recited the verse, desiring to arouse fear, trepidation, and terror in me, desiring to make me fall away from concentration. So it's interesting because Māra is this, trickster being, but at the same time, when we see how, in the depiction, for example, of in the Sutta Nipata, where the Buddha describes the armies of Māra. So the way through Māra comes and tempts us. And I'll actually quote it. I have it here. The Buddha says, sensual pleasures are your first army. Discontent, your second is called. Your third is hunger and thirst. The fourth is called craving. Sloth and torpor are your fifth. The sixth is called fear. Your seventh is doubt. Conceit and ingratitude are your eighth. Gain, renown, honor, and whatever fame is false to be received are the ninth. And whoever both extols himself and disparages others has fallen victim to the 10th. That is your army, Namuchi, the striking force of darkness. One who is not a hero cannot conquer it, but having conquered it, one obtains happiness. And it's quite interesting because he says at the end, once again, one who is not a hero cannot conquer it. And you'll see at the end of the sutta, Bhikkhuni Soma uses a similar sort of stance, saying it's fit for Māra to address. So fundamentally, whenever you're unenlightened, you're fit for Māra to address, because we can see at our mind and we can see how all these armies of Māra are constantly present in our minds. And that's because, as we were saying earlier, Māra is not only like a sort of actual being, but it's also the voices within our mind. So you can see how there is the experience of doubt when we analyze it within meditation practice. It's not that we feel like there is someone who comes and taps us on our shoulders and starts saying random things. I mean, that can also happen. Actually, our monastery cat Stan likes to do that. So sometimes I call him Māra, the evil one, trying to steer me away from concentration. He comes and he's like, starts walking on top of me and then going like meow, meow, meow when I get fed. But aside from that, generally, even the most sort of externally peaceful meditation can actually be very tormented. So we can see all the hindrances, for example, appearing and being described in the armies of Māra, also like in a sort of more structured way, like actual our emotional states. So fear, for example, gain, renown, honor, fame. So we'll talk about it actually apparently tomorrow in another one of my favorite suttas about this last one. But yeah, there's so much that can appear in the mind, and it becomes this battle, if you may, with ourselves, battle with concepts that we perhaps absorb from what we perceive as the outside world, that we internalize, we start juggling with, we start contemplating them, we start questioning, and they create the conditions for doubt. And in other words, actually, this is the practice that the Buddha multiple times, actually Venerable Pamuto yesterday in the sutta study that he shared with us, also spoke at length about it. We can see it also in the Somā Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, how the Buddha talks about how we unskillfully place our attention. Instead of right attention, most often than not, we cultivate wrong attention. So what he calls Ayya Soma. So for example, the thought that, in this case, gender has bad karmic conditions is an equivalent for something that is negative. So all the different stereotypes that are on gender really obsessing about them over and over again creates doubts in our capacity for awakening, but also creates, once again, establishes us more and more in our obsession with the self. So in our personality view. So who was I in the past? What have I done in the past to deserve such bad karma? Am I going to be capable in the future to attain awakening? So reinforcing our sense of self over and over again in the past and in the future. And so this is, of course, it's very important to make a distinction. One thing is to understand our karmic conditions. So for example, if we're the subject of a particular type of discrimination, it's very important to understand where it's coming from. So it's to dissect it into causes and conditions, and to get it into the stream of Dhamma. But while we're at it, to be very careful in protecting our mind, in not falling into believing sort of these ideas in one shape or form, and obsessing about them once again through wrong attention in the past and in the future. But rather, what the Buddha suggests is, once again, always going back to the Fourth Noble Truths. So to always analyzing where is the suffering. So there is suffering. The cause of suffering the cessation of suffering, and the way out of suffering. And that is a process that we can do in every single moment. So it's easily accessible and leads to liberation. And as we move through the sutta, we see that actually Bhikkhuni Soma has done that work already, as she is an enlightened being. So she understands straight away this is Māra Deva 1 and replies to him, what does womanhood matter at all when the mind is concentrated well, when knowledge flows unsteadily? So it's quite interesting here because there is a clear statement that there is both samadhi and vipassana present. So there's both a still mind, unified mind, and there is also a mind that has insights in how things are. There is a mind that has already understood the Four Noble Truths, a mind that has understood the three characteristics, and that this is a mind that is unshakable, just like the Buddha says over and over. That's how we can, only a mind of that kind, the mind of a hero, cannot be conquered by Māra. And it's a mind that has the strength of samadhi, the unshakable strength of samadhi, that eliminates all the hindrances from the mind and can defeat the armies of Māra. And there is, on this note, actually, a beautiful, another quote from our teacher, from the Buddha, who talks when, for example, he talks about he is attacked by Māra with, while he's attaining awakening, with his daughters. The Buddha says, describing this quality of strength of mind, he says, fools, you have tried to split a rock by poking it with lily stems, to dig a hill out with your nails, to chew up iron with your teeth, to find a footing on a cliff with a great stone upon your head, to push a tree down with your chest. So much Dhammasukha. So the mind of an arahat, so an enlightened being, has the same quality of strength of the mind of the Buddha. That is so eloquently described in these verses. So of course, this leads to rightly seeing through Dhamma, as Bhikkhuni Soma says. One sees correctly into Dhamma, actually. That's how it's translated by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. Because this unshakable mind pierces through ignorance and understands fundamentally the law of conditionality, of causality, of co-arising, which is fundamentally this being, this comes to me, this comes to be. When this arises, this arises. This not coming into being, this doesn't come into being. When this ceases, this ceases. And she goes on by saying, one to whom it might occur, I'm a woman, or I'm a man, or I'm anything at all. And you see how Bhikkhuni Soma presents in this context gender. and to a larger scale, anatta, non-self. So how can anything, including gender, have any essence in and of itself? How can it be something that has an inherent quality by birth? How can this be? How can this define us? How can this be who we are? How can we own it? So it's only a hindrance, only a problem if we make it a problem. So we see that Bhikkhuni Soma doesn't even like start arguing about gender, but rather goes back to the Dhamma, to a cardinal principle of Dhamma, which is unquestionable, and highlights the ridiculousness of presenting thoughts and ideas, particular on gender or on race or on nationality or on age or any type of identity that we think we are, or we think that others are, and that we think that define us or define others, and that we think are, because of our birth, being born with such particular condition, we are superior or we are inferior. So what that all boils down to is conceit. It's an idea that we exist in a particular shape or form, and that shape and form defines us. And that's where it's a prison for us. That is when it becomes a cause of suffering. But when we see rightly through Dhamma, then all of this starts dismantling. And we start seeing how gender is impermanent, no different than any other element in the world. It's both impermanent because it changes radically from lifetime to lifetime. So we've all been males, we've all been females, and we've all been like a degree of in between, possibly neither. But also the implications that gender have within our society. So for example, the idea that a patriarchal society, for example, is the status quo, is something that is sort of exists in an absolute way, when it's actually, just like anything else, impermanent. It's a historical condition. So when we analyze actually the history, we see that in late prehistoric societies, for example, there were lots of different ways through which humans were organizing themselves, which were not patriarchal societies. And we see how also to this day, in this day, right, rather than to this day, in this day, things are shifting and changing. Gender roles are shifting and changing. So why is this? This is because this being, this comes to be. When this arises, this arises. This not being, this does not come to be. With the cessation of this ceases. So as soon as we shift causes and conditions, something arises. So it's not that there is anything wrong or particularly specific. There is not a role that one has to fundamentally have in society due to their gender, but rather all of these things are shaped by numerous causes and conditions that are constantly changing, that are impermanent, that are unsatisfactory, and that are not self, they're impersonal. And in terms of once again, the birth quality, that idea that it's still quite prevalent in Buddhist circles and that we really need to make sure to remove is addressed quite clearly by the Buddha in the Vasita Sutta. So I'll end this talk by actually quoting the Buddha, who always knows and sees much better than everyone else. And in the Vasita Sutta, I'm only gonna, it's a very long sutta, so I'm just gonna quote a little extract. And this is the time when the Buddha is analyzing different kinds of birds. And he's progressively going through the different distinctive marks of birds, fish, snakes, butterflies, and so on. So all the different categories of beings. And then he says, while in these births, the differences of birth make their distinctive mark, with humans, no differences of birth make a distinctive mark in them, nor in the hairs, nor in the head, nor in the ears, nor in the eyes, nor in the mouth, nor in the nose, nor in the lips, nor in the brows, nor in the shoulders or the neck, nor in the belly or the back, nor in the buttocks or the breast, nor in the genitals or ways of mating. I would like to repeat that. Nor in the genitals or ways of mating. Another interesting way that humans unskillfully discriminate upon one another is based on how human beings like to mate with one another, so on their sexual preferences. Well, the Buddha says, no difference. And he keeps going, nor in the hands, nor in the feet, nor in the fingers or the nails, nor in the knees, nor in the thighs, nor in their collar. Once again, nor in their collar, another way, as we were saying, or in voice. More feminine voice, more masculine voice, a weird voice, an accent that is different than ours. Here, birth makes no distinctive mark, as with the other kinds of birth. In human bodies in themselves, nothing distinctive can be found. Distinction among human beings is purely verbal designation. So much Dhamma Sukha. I love this. It's one of my favorite suttas, of course. But it's wonderful how he, once again, points how the distinction is fundamentally by action, namely by the profession, most of the time. And he keeps going, saying, for name and clan are assigned as mere designations in the world. So classism, which is really big where I come from, in Italy, or in Europe at large, which is an older continent than the one where I currently reside. So classism here is a problem, yes, but no, to not even like close degree to the degree that is a problem in Europe. And of course, in India, not only ancient India, but to this day, where they have, of course, a classist system to begin with. So once again, for name and clan are assigned as mere designations in the world, originating in conventions. They are assigned here and there For those who do not know this fact, wrong views have long underlain their hearts. Not knowing, they declare to us, one is a Brahmin by birth. So Brahmins are historically the top of the hierarchy in the caste system in India. And the Buddha is very clear, one is not a Brahmin by birth, nor by birth a non-Brahmin. So Brahmin is also a synonym for spiritual practitioner, for someone who is pure, holy. And the Buddha is very clear on that. By action is one a Brahmin. By action is one a non-Brahmin. So in other words, by action one is holy. By non-action one is unholy. I mean, by action one is non-holy. For men are farmers by their axe, and by their axe are craftsmen too. And men are merchants by their axe, and by their axe are servants too. And men are robbers by their axe, and by their axe are soldiers too. And men are chaplains by their axe, and by their axe are rulers too. So that is how the truly wise see action as it really is. Seers of dependent origination, skilled in action and its results. Action makes the world go round. Action makes this generation turn. Living beings are bound by action like the chariot wheel by the linchpin. Asceticism, the holy life, self-control and inner training. By this one becomes a Brahmin. In this supreme Brahminhood lies. One possessing the triple knowledge, peaceful with being all destroyed. Know them thus, O Vasetta, as Brahma and Saka for those who understand. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Okay.
So much Somā Sutta.
Okay, thank you, Ayya. And there's a lot of questions and comments.
Wow.
So we might need to get Zen answers.
Okay, I'll try my best.
So Michael says, that's another straightforward sutta whose point that women are as capable as men to gain concentration is hard to miss. But in the Mahayana tradition, at least, there are sutras that enumerate all the reasons why women are unsuitable for ordination. Some of those reasons, such as women's emotional states, suggest an inability to concentrate as well. If it's relevant to ask, how do we address the issues that these later sutras raise?
Thank you for asking that question. So I'll try to make long story short, which is not admittedly one of my skill sets. By action, I'm not very good at that. But actually, I would say that in the Mahayana canon, there is quite a lot of stuff. And actually, in the Mahayana canon, there's also incredibly progressive statements that veer quite on the opposite end of the spectrum. So there's actually this famous sutta in the, what's it called?
Vimalakirti Nirdesha.
Yeah, in the Vimalakirti
Nirdesha.
That one. Where there's this goddess that switches gender with Sariputra to give him a realization of how empty of inherent existence gender is. So it's actually quite a beautiful and progressive sutta. So the sutta starts with Sariputra that is not particularly at his best with his sort of oratory skills and doesn't look particularly enlightened in that sutta, I have to say. That's perhaps like one of the downsides of the Mahayana suttas. Sometimes they like to poke fun at the historical arhats that for those of us who, start with the Pali Canon, it's kind of like, oh God, blasphemy, which, opens another can of worms of how attached we can be. Oh, sure. She's telling me story now. But anyway, so in there you see at the other end of the spectrum. So in the Mahayana canon, I would say that it's full of like a lot of different mixed messages, and one needs to pick and choose. In regards to the emotional, how women are deranged and angry, I mean, quite frankly, If you look at statistics, I feel like war and rape and aggression, if you actually murder, if you really have to, put it on a, like, who is the gender that wins in unwholesomeness, I'm not quite sure it is the women, so it's a little bit shaky, the argument. So the first time I heard it, I was like, I mean, in this culture, actually, I could say stereotypically, yes, I am quite emotional, but that's because the majority of people are Anglo-Saxon. So it doesn't really matter whether I am next to an Anglo-Saxon woman or an Anglo-Saxon man. But in Italy, men are pretty over the top. And I'm also like a tame Italian. So it really has to do with, once again, the causes and conditions that we have around. So the argument is only an argument when we decide to make it an argument. We can create so many different stereotypes and ideas and believe them. And of course, both in the Mahayana tradition, the Theravada tradition, and Vajrayana tradition, there have been enlightened beings and also the majority of unenlightened beings. So the canon, unless it's certain particular segments of the canon that that scholars, I'm not a scholar, but there are lots of scholars these days, luckily, that have done the work that can attest this is actually quote unquote authentic or from the time of the Buddha. A lot of it is post-canonical, which doesn't mean that it's not valid, that doesn't have good Dhamma, but it can also have a lot of Adhamma. So we have to generate, it's up to us to cultivate the wisdom to understand, to distinguish Dhamma from Adhamma. Not because we just read it in a book and that we're like, oh yeah, that sounds great. Not because we want to believe in it, or not because our teacher says that to us, but rather because we actually personally investigate it and we see it as true.
Okay, thank you. And Michael says, related, we are given to believe that only a male human can become a Buddha. Is this in the suttas?
So what there is in the Pali Canon that I am aware of is that a Sammā Sambuddha can only appear in male form. This is also the suttas that are in the questionable department of Buddhism. So I personally, my personal stance is, do I really want to waste so much time thinking about that? Actually, the Buddha says that in order to dispel the hindrance of doubt is to stop pointing your attention onto questions and arguments that are cause of doubt. So I noticed that whenever my mind starts investigating too much those particular suttas, I'm kind of like, is Buddhism actually really the path towards liberation? Does this really make sense? What about all those marks of the Buddha? And I'm like, it doesn't seem very skillful or useful. So my thing is, I put it on the side. In reality, none of us right now can be a Sammā Sambuddha. Whether you're male, female, transgender, nobody can. And that's because we're still under the influence of the Sammā Sambuddha. So fundamentally, if that is true, and the Buddha always comes in male form, who cares? Like, that is just a sort of attribute. How would we feel if it's said in the suttas that a Buddha always comes with blonde hair? Well, I don't have blonde hair. Or blue eyes. Or conversely, brown eyes and brown hair. I happen to have right now brown eyes and brown hair. So I'm like, oh yeah, okay, that's great. But realistically speaking, next life I could have blue eyes and blonde hair. So then it wouldn't apply to me. So it's all papancha in my mind. But Keshida's is like, short answers.
Okay.
These are short.
And Roland Rajo asks, Is Māra an actual being, or is Māra an analogy for our own struggles and issues? Is Māra a representation of our defilements, hindrances, and conscious?
All of the above. Fundamentally. Okay, that's the short answer.
Wow, good. Sarah Smith asks, she says, so interesting, much food for thought, and I am encouraged. I was surprised at the Italian stereotypes you experienced. Surely energy has no gender. Gender form is object and worldly, and although could be an additional karmic challenge, is just a path like any other circumstance.
I didn't quite understand the last question.
Neither did I. So it says, gender form is object and worldly, and although could be an additional karmic challenge, is just a path like any other circumstance.
Well, once again, I think rather than an answer, I would ask you a question. Why do you think it's a challenge? And so from there, I think that's where it's skillful to investigate these issues. It's not in terms of like, oh, what have I done in the past? And am I really going to be capable of enlightenment? Well, the Buddha actually gives straightforward answers, which I quoted during this talk from other suttas that have nothing to do with the Somā Sutta to begin with. But rather investigating it and seeing the causes and conditions why those thoughts arise in your mind. So really analyzing, why do I think that it's a sort of disadvantageous condition to be a woman? So where are these thoughts coming in our mind? I was a couple of months ago, I was watching this documentary on Malcolm X, who was encouraging African Americans to question where were they getting these thoughts of being inferior, of being ugly, of being not worthy or not intelligent or not good enough in comparison to white people. Where are those thoughts coming from? And of course, he was encouraging them to uproot them because they were not beneficial. So that's where it's useful to do the work to understand where are they coming from and understand that it's causes and conditions that create these thoughts or these ideas, those identities to come into being. And once we see that, then it's easier to take them and toss them because they don't belong to us. That's not who we are. But if we keep on holding on to them, we keep on thinking, oh, it's such bad karma to be a woman, or such bad karma to be a Black person, or it's bad karma to be, you name it, then we are reinforcing our self-identity. We're reinforcing our attachment to the I am in this shape and form in a negative way.
And last comment, Elaine says, I am so confused. The local, in parenthesis, what else is new? She says, the local Mahayana monk told me women can become Buddhas. Can? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And she says, applauding Ayya Soma for taking on these issues and answering tough questions. Love you, Ayya. You have inspired me to stay the path, block out doubt, and keep moving in the right direction.
Sadhu. Yes. Thank you actually for pointing that out in terms of the Buddha. That, once again, each tradition and actually each monk probably in each tradition will have a different sort of view on it, slightly different view. So I like not to take one particular view of any monk or not, but rather I like to focus on what did the Buddha say about that, in particular in the Pali Canon, in the suttas that scholars don't deem as questionable. And that's where my faith in the Triple Gem is secure. That's where my mind has Dhamma Sukha. Whenever I read words of Dhamma, my mind becomes very joyful. Whenever I read Adhamma, my mind is like, I don't know about that. And also doubt arises. So I'm very grateful. We have actually incredible good karmic conditions that so many scholars like Venerable Analio, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, and lots of others have done all this incredible work for us to have less sort of work, investigative work to do, and more practice to be done.
Great. Well, thank you, Ayya, for the wonderful Dhamma teachings. And thank you to everyone who joined in the discussion. So this evening, we'll have another meditation and Dhamma talk at 7:30 with Bhante Pamuto.
Or Bhante Sudaso, who will it be?
We'll see. And tomorrow morning, there'll be another sutta study with Ayya Soma. And tomorrow evening, we'll have mug chat. So your chance to ask all your random questions related to Buddhism. So thank you all for joining in, and we'll end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. See you next time.